Hello, everyone. Welcome. It is Mysterious Forces Live, and it is Friday, November 9th, 2018. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you so much for being here. Wow, do I have a great show for you tonight. I have Laird Scranton. He's a comparative cosmologist. He is the author of The Science of the Dogon. And this is going to be good stuff. You're going to dig this. And this is good, solid research and academics. So we're going to enjoy that. I have to give a shout out to all of my new subscribers. Thank you for subscribing to the channel. And thank you for liking the videos. And I am humbled by the amount of views and sharing and commentary and congratulations that I've received over the video I did on Wednesday with CW Chanter. And I want to thank CW for such an awesome interview. He is so cogent, and what he says is it's pretty deep stuff. You have to go along for the ride, but he's well-spoken, and I really appreciate it. And you haven't heard the last of the controversy surrounding that topic, but my guest tonight doesn't have a foot in the ufology world in that way. And so we're going to steer clear of that topic tonight because I want to be fair to Laird and give him a chance. But again, thank you to all the new subscribers and watchers. And hit the like button, hit the subscribe button, share these videos. I do have a, this is new and it's starting up, and I appreciate it. And I want to acknowledge, I know that a bunch of you came along and found me because of CW Chanter, and I want to acknowledge that. Thank you, CW. I really appreciate it. The exposure has really helped the show, and deep appreciation. So we'll continue with the ufology scandal doxing stuff. There will be follow-up material. But like I said, tonight we're going to talk to Laird Scranton, and we're going to give him the half hour. And I think you're going to be fascinated. So put on your seatbelts. He has been at this kind of work for decades. He deals with mythology and ancient traditions of civilizations. But in particular, he has studied the Dogon people. And they are a modern-day African tribe. They're based in Mali. And they have an interesting mix of traditions and religious beliefs, but at the same time, they have no written language. And there's also a deep cultural tie with ancient Egypt, as well as other spiritual traditions and science. And all of these things converge within the Dogon culture. And it's absolutely fascinating. And Laird Scranton, welcome to the show. Thank you for being here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me on. I really appreciate it. Seems like an interesting show.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it. We're new, and we don't have a really long track record, for you to go back over it and agree to be on it. But I'm going to treat you very well tonight, and I think that my viewers are really going to enjoy the topic. Can you give a bit of a primer to the audience on the Dogon people and how you came upon this topic?
Sure. The Dogon the Dogon are a modern African tribe. They're a primitive tribe. They came to public attention in 1975 because of a book called The Sirius Mystery that Robert Temple wrote. And the main issue about the Dogon at that time was they seemed to know some things about astronomy that they shouldn't reasonably know without having access to technology. They knew specifically about a relationship of stars in the Sirius system and orbital periods and the existence of stars that you can't see without a telescope. And so the question of how did they come across that knowledge seemed like it would be an interesting question for me, and that's what drew me in. The thing that makes the Dogon an especially good entry point into comparative studies is that their culture preserves elements of three different traditions. They do some things like ancient Judaism, some things like ancient Egypt, and some like ancient Buddhism. And so if you want to get to the bottom of what did a particular symbol or practice represent, you can compare two or three different cultures who use the same element and find out what they all thought of it and sort of triangulate in on what the original meaning was.
Wow, it's fascinating, and how this came to be is an interesting story. One of the primary questions that I would have is, they don't have a written language. Are they keeping any dead languages alive in their culture?
They have a very interesting language situation. Their language is technically unclassifiable because it includes at least 19 subgroups of languages that they are careful to keep pretty discreet. So these include words from the Turkish language, from the Dravidian languages of the Tamil. Their cosmology is given largely in what are ancient Egyptian words, although they don't have a written language. Um, they actually look down their nose on written language. Socrates did too. Um,
He's a hero of mine.
yes, the idea is that written language was seen as a way to misrepresent yourself, really. It was a way of representing yourself as an expert on a topic that you really didn't fully understand. And their Dogon perspective, like Socrates, was if I want to learn a complicated subject, I want to learn it from the master of the subject, the person who has done it for years, not learn it out of some written text. So the cultures that never adopted a written language are really the ones who've done the best job of preserving original ideas, as far as I'm concerned.
That's interesting. I know that there are some primitive tribes that have had different kinds of languages, and I'm remiss in not remembering the name of the tribe, but there is a tribe that had no reference to time in their language. They had no sense of past, present, and future. That syntax did not exist within their language. And when their neural pathways were studied, hopefully while they were not alive, they discovered that their neural pathways, literally their brain was physically mapped differently because of their different perspective on time and the passage of time. Are there any cultural peculiarities about the Dogon people that anything about their language or their culture that kind of sets them apart in that way?
Well, there are interesting perspectives. Archaically, in a lot of the, you see them in a number of traditions that make you sort of scratch your head and think for a minute. For example, their idea is that the modern idea is that the past is behind us and the future is ahead of us. Well, the Dogon see it the other way around. As far as they're concerned, the future is behind us and the past is ahead of us. And the way to conceptualize that is imagine all of your ancestors on a bus, um, situated so that the oldest ancestors are sitting at the front of the bus and the most recent ones are at the back. So you can imagine the great great grandparent getting off the bus before you do. The past is ahead of you; it's not behind you. Those kinds of differences in perspective. There are a number of different areas where those exist, and where you have to get used to a particular way of viewing things that is a little different than modern expectation.
Right. That's certainly a step away from the Western mind,
Uh,
excuse me, and the way we perceive the flow of time and whether it's linear in a linear fashion that we do.
Right.
Um,
I mean, many of the ancient cultures perceived, we look at north and south. We consider north to be up and south to be down. Well, the ancient Egyptians saw it the other way around. Upper was south and lower was north. This
that's fascinating.
Many of the references, the drawn references that are given in Buddhism and in ancient Egypt, have a reverse perspective. Even with the Dogon, it's like you're looking at a thing from the outside in, or you're looking at there's a star map on the ceiling of a temple at Dendera in Egypt that represents the southern hemisphere stars, not the northern hemisphere stars. So there are all sorts of indications that there may have been actual reversals involved, not just reversals in perspective.
Can you give us a more detailed look at their cosmology? Can you zero in on a particular belief or point of view that they have that
Well,
we would just find fascinating?
when they talk about cosmology, they're talking about three themes. These are creation themes. This is ideas of how creation happens. They're talking about how the universe was created, how matter was created, and how biological reproduction happens. And for the Dogon, those three processes are so fundamentally similar to each other that the Dogon simultaneously represent all three processes using a single progression of symbols. And so when you look at this, is part of why the symbolism gets complicated, because you can't ask what does a symbol of a hemisphere mean. You have to ask what does it mean if we're talking about biology, or what does it mean if we're talking about for how matter forms. Um, that's one of the interesting perspectives, is the parallelism. There's actually power in the parallelism, because if you can understand a reference in terms of matter, you can apply it in terms of biology. It's interesting stuff. The Dogon say their symbols describe how matter forms, and they correctly describe. I could see from my limited perspective beginning in this process that they had a correct understanding of an atom and a correct understanding of protons and electrons and neutrons. They could even diagram an electron orbit. So it looked to me as if they knew what they were talking about. But I had to educate myself about the descending structure from there to see if all the other descriptive stages they describe could also be scientific. And it turns out it looks like they are.
Did their connection with these very specific scientific principles carry over into other parts of their culture, like their architecture or art, or I don't know. I don't know if they're hunter gatherers, or if they do agriculture. What's their means of subsistence?
These are actually expert farmers, but they live in a very remote desert area of Mali in northwest Africa. They're about 8 hours across the desert from anything we consider to be civilized. That's, I think, a deliberate part of the plan to help sort of isolate their culture from outside influences. But according to the Dogon, this information came out of a deliberate civilizing plan in ancient times, whose purpose was to raise humanity up to a level of agriculture. And the civilizing instruction was tagged to a symbolic cosmology. They were interwoven with each other. And so all of the normal aspects of daily life for a Dogon tribes person carry symbolism that reinforces the cosmological concepts they were taught. It's a mnemonic system.
As the primary expert on this tribe, do you think that part of this cosmological view or this plan has any connection with potential alien cultures, alien influence, or maybe gods and goddesses and a religious influence?
Well, first of all, properly speaking, the Dogon system doesn't have anything that we would consider to be a traditional god. There's one mythological character who somewhat rises to the status of what we think of as an ancient god, but this is not in the same sense as ancient Egypt, where the Egyptians talk about deities. The Dogon talk about concepts and stages of creation that are scientific, and even down to the terminology they use to represent it. There are concepts associated with phonetic values that you can mix and match sort of root phonetics to create meanings, larger meanings. And you can see that the name of a thing reflects what the symbolism of it is. So the whole deity aspect really doesn't play into it for the Dogon. It looks like an originally scientific system, and part of the goal has been, through comparative studies, to demonstrate that all the other cultures saw it the same way that the Dogon do.
That's fascinating. Is reincarnation a part of their belief system?
Actually, only in a scientific way. The Dogon flatly say, the anthropologists who study them report that the Dogon flatly say that they do not have a belief in reincarnation that goes beyond the passing of traits through DNA to offspring. That having been said, there are many parallels between the Dogon system and the Buddhist system, Buddhist and Hindu systems, where reincarnation actually is an active concept. So I would have to place that in sort of an open question. I don't necessarily take one culture's statement as being the flat truth about things.
Wow, it's incredible. I find this an absolutely fascinating topic. So, do they turn to their ancestors for knowledge or for guidance in problem solving?
Well, the concept of ancestors is one of the metaphors that's used to try to convey information scientific information. The thing is that if there's a subject that I want to explain to you that you don't know about, and it's a complicated subject, but I happen to know that it's very similar to something you already understand, I can use a metaphor to immediately and intuitively help you grasp it. If I can relate the things I'm trying to describe to something I know you already understand, then wow, you've got it, and teaching you is so much easier. Well, the entire symbolic system is about that, and trying to find the various metaphors that will potentially resonate with an informed audience. And ancestors, the description of ancestors is one of those concepts that people are familiar with that can be used to explain other things. And so, yes, the notion of ancestors is a very important concept for the Dogon. And it really goes back to trying to explain stages of instruction of this civilizing plan.
Wow. Do they incorporate mathematics into their culture and language, or is everything conceptual constructs?
No, right from the very start, the system sort of leads with geometry and mathematics. There are numerous disciplines being taught at the same time. The grand symbol of these traditions is a form of aligned shrine. These are shrines that are aligned to the cardinal points. And the method that's used to align the shrines is a geometric method. It requires a unit of measure, and it requires senses of relative measure, and it requires an understanding of basic geometry, how to bisect, align, and concepts like that. So that this dates from a period that's at least 3,000 years before the ancient Greeks. So we have visibility through Buddhism and through the Dogon system on the actual practical use of geometry long before the ancient Greeks employed it.
Wow, that's fascinating. I have I don't want to get sidetracked. I have other questions in that direction, but what springs to mind immediately, and maybe the viewers want to know this: who has made contact with the Dogon people, and how do they have a liaison with the outside world, and have they been has their culture been contaminated at all by outside influences? How does that interaction, how are we getting this information, this contact?
Well, the studies I work from are anthropological studies that were done over a period of 30 years by Europe's leading anthropologist back in the 1930s, a Frenchman by the name of Marcel Griol. And he took teams into Dogon country on a regular basis and became so intimately involved with them that he was actually himself initiated in the Dogon esoteric tradition, was granted status as a Dogon citizen, and when he died in 1956, was given a Dogon burial.
Wow.
So this is highly reputable studies. They also produced a dictionary, which I work from, and they produced any number of articles that are also useful. But really, where the power is in the comparison to other traditions. To be able to go to Buddhism and verify a concept, or go to ancient Egyptian language and verify the pronunciation and meanings of a word, is enormously helpful. There are also additional insights when we start working with Egyptian hieroglyphs and compare some of the Egyptian words to Dogon words. It becomes clear that these glyphs that are used to write these words, the symbols, are not strictly phonetic the way that they're represented as being by modern Egyptology. There are only about 40 phonetic values that are represented in any written language, and the Egyptians had 44,000 glyphs. So it's pretty clear, even just from the outset, that they couldn't possibly need that many glyphs to represent strictly phonetics. As it turns out, it looks to me as if every Egyptian word worked sort of like a rebus puzzle, the children's puzzle where you have a picture of an eye and you say "I." Mm-hmm. Well, an Egyptian glyph is like that. Each of these glyphs is associated with a concept. And if you substitute concepts for glyphs, you produce a symbolic sentence that tells you the meaning of the Egyptian word. So there's lots of interesting material buried in those Egyptian words that give you nuances of meaning that affirm what the Dogon have to say.
Wow. Do you think that they had direct interaction with Judaic cultures, with Buddhist culture, and with Egyptian culture? Or do you think that they somehow tapped into, say, more of a collective unconscious in the Jungian sense?
No, the both. Okay, we have basically matching symbolic systems with the Dogon and the Buddhists, and the Dogon and the Buddhists are both saying the same thing. They're crediting deliberate instruction in ancient times that originally began with a non-human source. Um, that's a controversial concept for a researcher to try to wrap their arms around, but uh, the statement puts a researcher like me in a hard position because you have these detailed matching systems that were kept in separate languages, so one culture didn't get it from the other one wholesale, and both are documented in ancient times. So we can either argue that both cultures kept all of those details straight and got down to the question of, who'd they get it from, and somehow each misremembered in the same matching ways who they got it from, or else you can argue that they kept that last detail straight, and we have to allow the possibility that they were right in saying they got it from a non-human source. And part of my work has been to try to lay a foundation for a rationale for how we can understand that as being a reasonable statement.
Wow, that's incredible. And I just want to say I am in awe of your knowledge of this subject. This is incredible. I want to give a quick shout out to some of the people in the chat room. I see Robin Eaglesong, Jet Pet. Let's see, Lisa P. Of course, thank you so much. I couldn't be doing this without you. And Lisa P. You rock. Please be nice and be nice to each other. We had a little bit of some squirrely stuff was getting said during the show with CW. Be nice to each other. Don't troll each other. We'll kick you out. There's no reason to be nasty with each other. So let's see. Sherry Scoville. I don't know who in the hell that is. Let's see. Robert Elder. And I know that I saw Robert from the chat last night at CW. I just want to acknowledge you. Thank you for being here. I appreciate it. And it's interesting to see who will turn in without CW here. I'm nothing without CW, apparently. So, Anyway, so I didn't want to get too sidetracked on that. My next question about the Dogon people is, with this cosmology, do they have a tremendous sense of good and evil, reward and punishment in the way that some Western or Judeo-Christian religions do? Does this carry over into the ethics of their culture and how their society functions on a day-to-day basis?
Dogon the Dogon tradition is actually a very non-judgmental tradition where Christianity opposes good and evil. The Dogon oppose truth and error. Very non-judgmental. The idea is that if you make an attempt to understand something and you get it wrong, all that means is that you need to try it again. There's no malintent associated with that. Even in an everyday Dogon village, which is typically a very peaceful place, one of the ways they keep it peaceful is with a group meeting house called a toguna, where anytime a dispute arises between more than two people, all of the interested parties are required to go to the toguna, and they can't leave until they've resolved the issue to everybody's satisfaction. It's a very reconciliatory society, very peaceful society, non-judgmental. Also, without strong concepts of good and evil, it's not possible to have concepts of heaven and hell or of judgment, eternal judgment or things like that. So it's a different perspective. It's a sort of a kinder, gentler perspective on a lot of the same issues and concepts.
That's nice. And I respect consensus. I respect consensus as a way to get things done. I don't think we in America in particular or in Western civilization have much patience for consensus. And Americans especially don't have much tolerance for consensus. But I think if some of our decision-making process were rooted in consensus, I think we might find that we have to be a little kinder to our neighbors and fellow citizens and less dismissive.
Well,
Um,
when we think that the two house system we have, the House and the Senate for establishing laws, exist because they couldn't reach a consensus. There were two perspectives on how things should be done, but rather than going forward with a polarized viewpoint, they just did it two ways at once. They satisfied both groups. We'll do it here. We'll require to do it one each way that satisfies each group. And many of the structures of our society were established precisely that way, to satisfy the competing factions because they couldn't reach consensus.
wow. Wow, that's awesome. I keep saying that. I know it's I have the stupidest comebacks tonight, but I'm just, my head is exploding. So my awe is genuine and sincere, and I know the viewers are like, is she really going to say that each time? Probably. But so are the Dogon people, is their culture matriarchal, patriarchal, or have they found, like everything else they seem to be doing, have found a third way between those polarities?
Well, the cosmology itself um, began in archaic times as a matriarchal tradition. The shift to patriarchal is only one of a cluster of symbolic reversals that all happen cross-culturally at about the same point midway through the tradition from archaic times till now. And there are cosmological reasons why that happens. A good example I can give you to help you relate. Imagine a cross-country flight, airplane flight, and everyone on the flight, when they arrive on the other coast, knows to switch their watch 3 hours. It's not because of any contact among the people on the plane. It's because we all understand how time works, how time zones work. It's the same way with the cosmology. There are eras to the cosmology, and certain symbolism is appropriate to certain eras. As the era changes, everybody flips the symbol.
Wow. I was just trying to avoid my other response. What circumstances existed? What special conditions existed that allowed this tribe to evolve and seem to? I want to choose my words carefully, and I think everyone will see why in here a second. Let me think of how to phrase this. Compared to other primitive tribes that appear on the surface to not have come to incorporated more cosmological, that's not even the right word, because I'm taking an anthropological standpoint here, and I'm also trying not to say something wrong conceptually. What circumstances allowed them to grow and develop this philosophy that they have, this outlook that separates them from other primitive tribes?
Well, it looks to me as if there was an initial attempt made in archaic times, around 12,000 years ago, to teach this information globally. It looks like whoever was on top of this knowledge was talking about how matter forms and how the universe forms, had no problem moving globally, and that an effort was made to instruct everybody in it. And then a second effort was made about 4000 BC. And by that period of time, the Dogon happened to be among the groups that had done the best job of preserving the original instruction. And because of that, it looks to me as if the Dogon served as sort of assistant teachers, assistant professors to the second round of instruction that happened just before dynastic Egypt.
Wow.
And
do you think that they had... Go ahead.
Go ahead.
I was going to say, do you think that they had emissaries or representatives that actually had contact with these cultures for the purpose of disseminating this more quote unquote civilized kind of information?
According to the traditions I study, instruction was carried out in specific remote locations, and groups were brought 8 at a time to that location. This is the whole dynamic that we see, sort of an archetype dynamic of the 8 ancestors who bring civilizing skills to China or in South America or in Egypt or other places. According to the Dogon, because it was risky to be for humans to be around these non-human teachers, they limited the exposure by bringing 8 people at a time to be instructed, and then sent those 8 back to their original cultures to teach everybody else. That looks like the dynamic to me. It also looks to me that around 3000 BC, many of the members of the priesthoods of early ancient cultures and of the kingships of ancient cultures like ancient Egypt were drawn from this class of African assistant professors. And so this is why you find large African carved heads in South America, and why you have early pharaohs in Egypt whose images look like they were African. It's because this particular group happened to have a facility for retaining this information and prioritizing original forms. And that's really what Dogon society does. It tries to prioritize original language and practices and myths and rituals. They seem to have been very good at it. I'm just trying to get down to the bottom and verify that these really were original in terms of other cultures.
Right. Are there any current researchers or academics that have contact with this tribe? And is there any ongoing work, or is everything just research that was done in the past that people
there was a restudy, a short-term restudy done of the Dogon in the 1980s by a professor named Walter van Beek from Belgium. His specialty had not been religion, it had been actually ecology, and he brought a team into Dogon country. The problem is the French anthropologists describe a closely held secret tradition among the Dogon. This is typical of the esoteric tradition, where it's designed in a way that it doesn't really reveal its knowledge easily to outsiders. As a matter of fact, a Dogon priest is required either to remain silent or to lie if they have to, if they're pressed for answers by somebody who's not an initiate to the tradition. So this restudy found no evidence, quote unquote, no evidence of the French tradition among the Dogon when they did the restudy. The problem is that the Belgian team missed the parallels between the Dogon Align shrine and a Buddhist stupa. And the Buddhist stupa connects to a matching cosmology. So the Belgians concluded that the Dogon priests had fabricated this cosmology for the sake of the French anthropologists. That can't possibly be true, because we have a perfectly worldwide accepted matching cosmology with the Buddhists that takes exactly the same forms, has exactly the same secrecy, and so forth. So yes, there have been attempts to restudy it. The esoteric tradition is sort of an obstacle to that. If I myself were to go to Dogon country and start asking leading questions of a Dogon priest, chances are he wouldn't talk to me. He'd have to get permission from a tribal council to even speak to me.
Wow. Do they have a meditative practice or a contemplative or form of asceticism that they use in their spiritual practices?
Well, this comes out of an archaic philosophy called Samkhya, which underlies the traditions in India. Samkhya is a cosmological philosophy that's a companion to yoga. So this is very ancient stuff and very contemplative, very internalized. There's a yoga is essentially the individualized, internalized version of this cosmology. And so the original teachers of the cosmology were yoginis, female yoginis back in archaic times, and they're counterparts to the Dogon Hogan priests who teach it now. So yes, there are elements of that, but it's not the aspect that's emphasized by the French anthropologists.
Wow, interesting. So they clearly state that their knowledge, their information, this teaching came from direct contact with another people rather than channeled or somehow given through a deity or through a person or a personality.
They flatly describe deliberate instruction that occurs in a material frame. One thing you can compare it to is the stories in the Old Testament of Moses on the mountain with God. There was clearly something happening physically on that mountain if we accept that story as being a true story. And there were extreme cautions issued to the Israelites not to approach too close to the mountain because of the bad effects. It's precisely that scenario. The that the Dogon and the Buddhists are representing non-human instruction in a material frame.
Wow, fascinating. It's incredible. Have you found? Well, I'm going to watch this. I'm going to go back later and I'm going to see all my responses and just laugh at myself. I'm already laughing at myself, but uh, I'm going to have to work on that. I need to go to Toastmasters. That's what I need to do next. I need to go to Toastmasters and get rid of all the and I know it's horrible. I'm super self-conscious.
You're doing a good job. Yeah.
I just had to come up for air for a second. So does the Mali government take any proactive steps to isolate the tribe or to protect them from outside influences?
The Dogon, the main protections the Dogon have is their remote location, and their villages are located along cliffs. In earlier centuries, they lived actually up on the cliffs as a way of protecting themselves. The upheaval in Dogon country, or in Mali, has prevented people from getting to Dogon country. It's been too dangerous to travel in Mali. I know an Argentinian filmmaker who has been making Dogon concept films and had to film in other places like Burkina Faso because Mali was just too dangerous politically in recent years. I wouldn't say that Mali has done anything to specifically protect the Dogon, but the Dogon tribal structure, there are about 300,000 Dogon people, and their village structure, their cultural structure has built-in protections that do a really good job.
Do they share a common link with other First Nations peoples around the world in that they view themselves as a part of nature that is a whole, and that everything is alive, including rocks and trees, and that the planet itself is a living being slash ecosystem? Or do they have more of a Cartesian Descartes? Descartes, the Cartesian model that said that spirit and the physical world are two separate things. Is it more Cartesian or integrated?
The scientific parallelism of the cosmology answers that question for us, because in their mindset, consciousness arises through the same principles and dynamics that matter does. And so you have essentially the components that are causing matter to produce the objects are the same fundamental dynamics that cause consciousness to produce life. So that it's all the same stuff, just rearranged a little bit and rearranged in parallel with each other. So if you understand how matter forms, you have can guess certain aspects of how biology happens. So down at the root level, consciousness the potential for consciousness inheres in everything. For the Dogon, universes form in pairs, and they discuss 7 pairs of universes as being in existence that configure like a helix, which calls to mind DNA. And if you can accept that kind of parallelism, then you see that the potential for life may be wired right into the structure from the highest to the bottom-most levels.
Wow.
Like weeds, if you can drop the seeds for a weed in a place that will support life by any stretch of the imagination, you get a weed growing. That's how life works.
Incredible. We are going to wrap it up. It's unfortunate, but you know what? I'll tell you why. I don't want to stretch this out too long, and I'd like you to come back again.
I'd be happy to.
You have such fascinating information that can't all be contained, and I kind of want to put a bookend on it because I think there's more to talk about, and I think we'll just save it for another episode. Truly, where can people find your work? What's your website? And just tell the people how to find you.
Okay, well, I don't actually have a website. There is a LairdScranton.com, but it's sort of a defunct fan site. My publisher is Inner Traditions, so you can find my books at innertraditions.com or at simonandschuster.com. There is an author page for me in both of those places. There's an author page for me on Amazon. You can usually find one or more of my books on the bookshelves in a Barnes & Noble if you walk in. My books can be ordered through any bookstore. if people want to find me personally, the easiest way is probably through Facebook, or friend me on Facebook and then message me. Then if there's more to discuss, very often I'll give my email address to somebody and we'll talk privately by email. That's really, don't confuse me with all the other Laird Scrantons out there, though.
I know. I found like 572 of them. That is not true. But you will find a lot of videos out there, folks. It's really good. It's good stuff, as you can tell. It was amazing. And thank you, Laird, so much. I appreciate it. You're welcome back anytime. And we're going to ask you back soon because this was just good stuff. I want to give a shout out to my friends. Jiggy from Paranormal Hood, CW Chanter, the Dark Journalist, gave me a shout out on his show today. And I'm thinking that maybe you should make a drinking game out of this episode and go back, and every time I say wow in response to one of Laird's segments, then you take a shot, and I think you'll get hammered. I want to say Jasmine, Robert Elder, Jet Pet. I'm just scrolling over everybody. They're here. That's interesting. Thanks, guys. I appreciate you being here. Subscribe, like, share. I appreciate it. Laird, thank you so much. Have a good night, sir.
Thank you very much.